Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast with myself, one of your hosts, Mr. Laz Michaelides, and on the screen opposite me, your other host, Mr. Felipe Amorim. How you doing, bro?
All right, bro, and you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. What's going on today?
Well, same old, loads of teaching, and I have a gig immediately after this recording. So
Fantastic. Are you by any chance playing any 60s rock and roll at this gig, or is it just blues?
no, it's just blues this time. Blues, country, and rockabilly. Oh, maybe some 50s rock and roll, not 60s.
Oh,
no, because are we gonna talk about anything from the 60s? Is that it?
We are. So, I mean, without further ado, I want to get in straight away because it's a big album. There's lots to talk about. So the album we are doing today is arguably one of the most famous albums in modern Western contemporary music. We are doing Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, which is an album I chose to do. Quick few facts before we get in, because I don't really want to get into all the nitty-gritty facts of it. I just want to discuss this with Felipe. Released May 1966, recorded between July 65 and April 66, 36 minutes in length, produced and written by Brian Wilson. Felipe, where do you want to start, man? I mean, I've got so much to say about this, but
I'm gonna start by giving you a shocking information about my relation with this album.
Oh, okay, go for it.
I wasn't familiar with Pet Sounds at all.
What, before? You mean in general, or before this episode?
Before we started my research for this episode. Fantastic. Obviously, when I'm saying not familiar, it means I have never listened to this album start to finish. Oh. I knew some of the singles, and I obviously knew the cover, and I knew about them, but for some reason I never got into the Beach Boys, and I'm not afraid to confess this here.
That's fine. I love that, bro.
Sometimes some bands they never appeal to you in any way, and just didn't listen to more than a couple of songs.
But honestly, bro,
it's shocking because they're so famous, right?
But there's times where I feel like every album I suggest that we do, I feel like you go, oh yeah, I know this band, or oh yeah, I've heard this album, because you're older than me. Naturally, I think you've listened to more. I'm so glad that we're in this position. I got to ask you straight away, what did you think of it?
When I think about it, the only thing that comes to my mind is the historical context of the album. It makes me think of, imagine how it felt to listen to those songs on the radio at the time.
Yeah.
And if I think about it, how it sounds now, it does make me think a lot of movie soundtracks and TV soundtracks in many ways, for the instrumentation and the weird sounds they have in it. Absolutely. It's kind of not, it doesn't sound revolutionary if I think about the things that have been done after it. But if you think about the context, 1966.
Yeah.
So if I listen to the arrangements from this album, thinking about the fact it has been released in 1966, it's pretty amazing.
It is, isn't it? Do you like it as an album? Do you like the songs?
I like it, and I like because in a certain way it's a concept album, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's go straight in there. It's a concept album about the life of Brian Jones at this point. Now, I think it's important to say that
Brian Wilson.
Or did I say Brian Jones? Oh God, did I say that at the start as well? Did I say Brian Jones at the start?
No, you said Brian Wilson.
Okay, so I only got it wrong once. That's fine.
They're both great musicians.
Exactly, yeah. Brian Wilson. So it is the life and emotional state of Brian Wilson. And this album was essentially an autobiographical centerpiece of his life. Lyrically, he took a lot of inspiration from his own life and what was going on.
Yeah, and apparently, because I'm not really familiar with the band at all. The lyrics before, they did all the songs that were about surfing and girls and cars and typical American teenage band, and to talk about deeper emotions and relationships and that kind of stuff, it wasn't what the audience or the label were expecting for that. Yeah. So the label didn't quite like it. They even pushed a best of album immediately after this one, and to kind of try to focus on it.
Oh, yeah. Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned the surf stuff because the Beach Boys were essentially one of those surf bands that kind of transitioned into rock and pop. The beach theme of the Beach Boys ended in 1964. That's when kind of they put a halt on their surfing records. Brian Wilson chose to stop touring and write more classically inspired albums, and he began this in 1965. Now, there is a particular album that Wilson that had inspiration from when writing Pet Sounds, and that was the Beatles Rubber Soul, which we did in episode 22. So it's actually, if you haven't listened to episode 22 of our podcast, you should go back and listen to it, because we're going to see a lot of similar themes. Although musically it's very different, the core of each album is the same. They both wanted to write albums that had no filler and that meant something from start to finish. And Brian Wilson said that he wanted to create music on the same level as Rubber Soul. And there's a famous story of him talking to his wife and listening to Rubber Soul and coming away and saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go and write the greatest rock album ever.
Yeah, I mean, what a statement, right?
I know, yeah.
And it's kind of impossible to talk about this album without talking about the Beatles.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it feels to me like the Beatles were always somehow haunting Brian Wilson for his whole music life, and he just wanted to be as good as the Beatles or better in that case. I'm going to ask you one question: has he achieved that? It was a bit too much of a strong statement to say the greatest rock album of all times. Like,
you're going to hear my thoughts on it in my monologue at the end, so I'm going to leave that open-ended. But what I will say is how different it is to a Beatles record, or to the Beatles record that we're talking about, which is Rubber Soul. Now, I think the first thing to address, and you said this right at the start, is the instrumentation. It made you think of things like film soundtracks, and that's very normal because it was very classically oriented. It has a classical feel to it. If you go and listen to the roots of the Beatles, you're hearing the blues. That's kind of obvious. The blues, rock and roll, Whereas when you come to the Beach Boys, we know that their roots were in that same sort of stuff, the rock and roll and the surf, but Brian Wilson actively tried to make this a classically sounding album, and I think that there is the first distinguishing factor between Rubber Soul and this album, is that Rubber Soul came from the blues and Pet Sounds came from a classically inspired sound.
Exactly, and it's interesting because this is such a weird motivation, I think, to write an album. I want to be better than the other guys.
Yeah.
It worked. I mean, in a way that it pushed him really hard to the limit of his creativity, to the point he let go of even playing, right? And the band, the one thing I find particularly interesting, which when I was listening to it first, it kind of upset me. And by the end of the album, I changed my mind. It's really, really weird. My first listen to the album was like, well, they singing, the harmonies are beautiful, but they're not actually playing, right? There's loads of because there's classical instruments and French horns and weird objects, and they used, that's really interesting to mention, they used the Wrecking Crew, which was an LA session band, session musicians who used to work for different artists like Sinatra, like the Mamas and the Papas, and there's no fixed lineup for the Wrecking Crew. There's loads of people. One of the most famous of them is Hal Blaine, the drummer. So I knew about them because of him, because I'm familiar with this particular drummer who is one of the best of all times. But so the fact that they were using session guys for literally everything, plus experimenting with sounds, and the only thing that the band really does in the album is singing, I thought, oh, wait a minute, that's not very rock and roll, innit? Like, come on. I want a rock and roll band to be playing, playing the instruments. That's what a rock band does. By the end of the album, I understood that was a compromise in order to achieve the exact concept Brian Wilson was looking for. And I have the utmost respect for him for doing it like that, because it works.
It does, it
And
does.
that's rock and roll.
You mentioned the Wrecking Crew. Now, just to clarify, the Wrecking Crew in this particular album, as Felipe said, they were like kind of this group of session guys. But for this album, there was 57 different instrumentalists, including the drummer Felipe mentioned, a bass player called Carol Kay, who is huge influence to bass players. If you're a bass player, you'll know her. She came up with that bass line on Good Vibrations. And also in the Wrecking Crew was Glenn Campbell, who is a singer-songwriter from America. He did a famous song called The Wichita Lineman. Again, as usual, guys, any songs we mention will be in the playlist below, so check it out in the show notes. Now, I read somewhere that there is an average of 12 different musicians on each track for this album, which is really cool, isn't it? Because there's just so much going on. I think...
And isn't it that there's a concept there, like when you want to achieve a certain sound, well, to quote themselves, you got to let go of your ego and find, like if someone else can play that part in a way that you can't play, so hire someone who can do it. And that in that case, I think by not playing the instruments in the album, I think the band was making it more about the songwriting than anything else. Although we keep talking about, how revolutionary the whole thing was, like so much innovation with different instruments and production styles and everything. But by doing that, he actually emphasized the songwriting, which is, amazing when you think about it.
As incredible. And there's a particular quote here. This is particularly for the song 6 called Let's Go Away for a While. The song itself is an instrumental and it's very jazzy. Now, before I get back to my point, I will just say quickly that there's two other artists who I'm going to mention a lot in this episode. The first one we've already mentioned is the Beatles, and the second one is Frank Zappa. Because during this time in the sort of mid to late 60s, you had the transition of the Beatles in Britain going from blues and the rock and roll to a more defined pop sound. You had the Beach Boy, we'll go to the other end. You had Zappa taking the doo-wop, taking the blues, taking the rock and roll and going very avant-garde and very weird. And then in between them, you got the Beach Boys, who did the same thing, took the rock and roll, took the surf, took the blues, and met in the middle. They had enough pop to appeal to a mass audience, unlike Zappa, but they had enough avant-garde, proggy jazziness to kind of stand out from the rest of the pop acts. So the reason I said this is because track 6, Let's Go Away for a While, is an instrumental and it's very Zappa-esque to me. Reminds me of a Zappa song called Lumpy Gravy, which will be in the playlist. But there's a particular quote I read about this song. I can't remember who said this, but listen to this. What's special about this is not that Brian was trying to introduce classical music into rock and roll, but that he was trying to get classical musicians to play like rock musicians.
And he was pushing really hard for that, wasn't he? He was like demanding a lot from the musicians on studio. There's references of him like singing the sounds he wanted to come from the horns or from percussion. Like, I want you to play this. So like I'm making a sound with my mouth and I just want you to somehow get that sound out of your instrument. And again, it's a step back from playing and basically putting your brain entirely into being creative.
Yeah.
And it's like, I have the ideas in my mind and I'm going to get loads of people who are really capable of executing those ideas and bringing them to life. And even for songwriting, he had a partner for this album, Tony Asher.
That's right. Yeah. Do you want to tell him about Tony?
Well, the most interesting thing about him is he was writing jingles for an advertising company, including for the Barbie doll. So,
really? Wow.
So he was doing jingles for toys and stuff like that. And so think about it. That makes him a very how can I put it? He's a specialist in doing commercial music.
Yeah.
So something that's accessible, direct, and in your face. Because when we write a jingle, it's a few seconds long, and you need to deliver all the information and make people want to buy something. Imagine that guy writing pop music. That might be one of the reasons why the songs are so short and the lyrics. I was going to
say, imagine if he was the one who had to say to Brian Wilson, "Brian, listen, mate, that's just a bit too far. Let's just rein it in a little bit."
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a great quote here from Tony Asher, who he said, the general tenor of the lyrics was always his, Brian Wilson's, and the actual choice of words was usually mine. I was really just his interpreter. I love that because that really shows a working together between these two, doesn't it?
Well,
Brian, go on.
you know what I read about them is they got together and they were smoking weed together and
Yeah.
and creating in that exactly as you said. Brian Wilson would say, "I want to talk about this. Can you write the lyrics about this specific feeling?" And he would go on and write those lyrics. And it's just I think he managed to grasp the concept. You know, it's like how can you bring someone else's ideas to life? In such a perfect way as it did.
And I mean, I want to just continue with lyrics for 1 second because I don't really have much to say. I know you're normally the lyrics guy, but there is one lyric that captured my, I don't know what word to use, not heart, but it really made me feel like I was listening to something so original and so personal to this one person, obviously the person being Brian Wilson. The lyric is in track 3 called That's Not Me. And my favorite lyric is this. I could try to be big in the eyes of the world, but what matters to me is what I could be to just one girl.
Oh wow.
Isn't that fantastic?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember the line. It is fantastic.
You've got
Well
a man.
written.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, you've got a man who is finding and achieving success with his band, with his songwriting. He could try to be big in the eyes of the world, but all that matters to him is what he could be to just one girl. And I get goosebumps talking about it because that particular, the chord progression that goes on underneath that, it really hits a special place in me musically. It just works so well. And I just felt such a vulnerability listening to this. Even, God, what, 50, 60 years later, listening to this and still being imagine being in the shoes of Brian Wilson, who sat there, wants to write this epic rock album that could, and maybe is the best ever, but he's not focusing on his already achievements and what this album could mean to him. He's focusing on personal lyrics. And do you remember we said exactly the same thing about Rubber Soul? We said Rubber Soul was the album where the Beatles stopped singing about boy meets girl, girl falls in love, all this stuff, and they started talking about themselves. Doesn't that just immediately open up an avenue between artist and audience of saying, this is me, come and take what I'm feeling, I'm telling you how I'm feeling.
Yeah, exactly. And we also said this when we were talking about Breakfast in America by Supertramp. There's loads of stuff. There's like reflecting on your own feelings and how you react to the world around you or to a person who you're with. And it's, pop music does that. Pop bands do that, but they do that at a very superficial level, in my opinion. In general, I would say modern pop music, as we tend to go back to the past with our podcast instead of going into more modern music. If you compare the lyrics at the time, I think there were loads of rock artists trying to dig deep into their feelings and so like, what makes me human, and what is love for me? It's not like what is love in general. And it's funny because at the beginning of the album, the first song, Wouldn't It Be Nice, is a single. Mm-hmm. And it's an amazing song. It's a shuffle up tempo, super cool song. It starts like with the vocals really strong, but it's a very naive approach to love. It's like, like what if we live together kind of vibe. It would be so cool, this and that. And it gets darker as the album progresses, as it's
you're right,
losing his loved one. And I read this thing on the Rolling Stone magazine. There's an article about the album, and they say something that I think it really sums up the content of the lyrics. It's youthful optimism versus adult cynicism.
And that's the album, isn't it? Because it starts with Wouldn't It Be Nice is the full-blown optimism, and maybe Caroline No at the very end is the adult cynicism.
Yeah.
Polar opposites. Brilliant stuff.
It's what it is. But that story just flows. That is the main thing. I think the one thing they achieved that even the Beatles couldn't achieve is um, there's a sense of unity in the album with all the craziness, all the experiences they make in there. There's a sense of unity as this is a story told from start to finish. Whilst when you listen to Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper's, there's a concept about production, but the songs were written individually and they are independent songs. They're not
Yes,
part of a concept. They're
you're
not
absolutely
telling
right.
one story.
Yeah.
So Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper's are amazing albums. But when I think about a concept album, I would say The Wall is a concept album. There's a story. Metropolis Part 2 by Dream Theater is a concept album. There's a story.
Yeah.
This one, although you can, that's the magic of this album. You can isolate the songs and listen to them as individual, like love songs or relationship songs. But when you piece them all together, there's a story being told, and the instruments are a big part of it, and they keep the concept together. They tie the album together in a way that maybe no other album has ever achieved before.
So, talking more about those instruments and the creativity and the avant-gardeness, I did mention Frank Zappa, and funnily enough, Frank Zappa in 1966 released the album Freak Out, which was a concept album, or was it 67? That's my bad. My favorite composer, and I've forgotten his debut album. I think it's 66.
Don't need to remember every single year, man.
Yes, I know.
No one does.
But it is fantastic because, like I said, you've got these three albums. You've got Rubber Soul, Pet Sounds, and Freak Out, which has the hugely different levels of avant-garde and poppiness in. So, for example, the second song of this album, You Still Believe Me,
Yeah.
the bicycle horn at the end of it. Do you notice that when it comes in, it's like,
Yeah.
it's just ridiculous.
Horn, yeah.
But 2 years before that, Frank Zappa appeared, before he was a songwriter, on a TV show, and he played the bicycle. He turned a bicycle upside down on a TV show, spun the wheels, and got a drumstick and was tapping the spokes of the wheel whilst pressing a bell in time and just taking this different approach to sound. And this is what the Beach Boys have done here. I think it's so interesting that we're hearing such a poppy sound coming from a man who is so obviously trying to push the boundaries of what sound is. I mean, it sounds to me like they've tried to make a pop album using as many non-pop instruments and sounds as they could. Many unorthodox instruments like bicycle bells, French horns, flutes, the theremins, string sections, even drink cans they did. But is that not the proof of an incredibly eclectic music mind at work?
Yeah, I mean, it is, because in the end, those things can go really wrong.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? They can.
Well, Pink Floyd attempted to do an album without instruments, just using objects and stuff, and they dropped the idea because they said it's just sounding like crap, so we don't want to release it. And
so it's just funny.
Isn't it what you would expect? Sounds like crap.
I just like imagining being in that recording studio and David Gilmour going, "Guys, this sounds like shit. We can't do this."
Can I just play my fucking guitar? And that's it. There's no like electric guitars, and there's the song I Know There's an Answer. There's a harmonica being used as a bass. I mean, there's a bass in the song, but there's a kind of a second bass line played by the harmonica. So really low notes on the harmonica instead of the high notes we usually get from the instrument.
Fantastic.
And it's like sometimes you're using an instrument that is somehow conventional, but not using it in a conventional way. I'm going to mention a songwriter, composer from Brazil, a guy called Hermeto Pascoal, and I'll send you some stuff so we can put on the link for everyone.
Can you say that slower for others who? What's the name?
Hermeto Pascoal.
Hermeto Pascoal.
Yes, exactly, with an H at the beginning.
Excellent. You got to send us before you explain about him. Send us over a YouTube video, and I'll put it in the show notes for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, because he used to make sounds of toys and objects, and he had a concept that was he's still going, I guess, still doing gigs and stuff. The idea was unusual music with conventional instruments, or conventional music with unusual instruments, but never the conventional stuff with the instruments, never. And maybe in a certain way is what's happening in this album, right?
Yeah, yeah, pushing the boundaries, going for something. I mean, the whole approach to it is very different. I mean, one thing that was very, very important and a huge, a wholly new approach to pop music was the hugely different approach to chords, because he really messed around with chords, voicings, and arrangements. He wouldn't go for the standard 3-part harmony that the Beatles were doing, with the root note being sung and then the guitarist singing a third up and then the bass player singing a fifth up from that. He would try and arrange chords really differently, and he, throughout the album, in quite a lot of the songs, the key of the song is never fully established, or if it is, they're always moving and switching it. And this is getting a little theoretical, but it's called the tonal center of the song. If you think,
well, as a drummer, I think I know a way to explain this to people who don't play chords.
Go for it, do it.
Which is my case. Well, when you have a certain key to a song, there's some notes that you expect to be played on that key, and some chords that are made out of those notes that belong to a certain key. If you insert chords that belong to different keys, that still works, but depending on how much you do that, you don't know exactly which key we're talking about, isn't it?
Bro, that's probably the best definition of tonal center I've ever heard. Well done. Honestly, for a drummer, well done. That's incredible.
Oh, honestly, mate, I'm not only a drummer, I have a paper saying that I'm a musician. I'll show it to you.
Honestly, but bro, seriously, I don't think I could have said that any better. That is brilliant. So yeah, for all the listeners, what Felipe said is true. And in this album, Laz Felipe said, loads of chords and unusual tonal centers. Expanding on what Felipe said, it would make sense to go from one tonal center to another if they're linked with a note or two, because you could play tonal center 1, start playing 1 or 2 of the next tonal center's notes, and you're hinting at it, and then you're going to move to the new tonal center. But in this album, it is all over the place, and that's not in a way of saying it's messy. It just keeps jumping from section to section. I mean, the third song, That's Not Me, which is one of my favorite. You've got that section where it goes, and I once had a dream, but I packed up and left for the city. And then it changes. It goes, I too found out that my lonely life wasn't so pretty. That's a new key. And then it drops straight back down to another one. I once had a dream. And it just keeps going back and forward. And this happens throughout the album. The song...
My feeling with those transitions is like, if you drop the whole music theory thing and just listen, it feels like, oh, he's going to a place that I wasn't expecting, like melodically. Yeah, this song is going to a weird place, but it makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's not as, well, I know you love him, but Frank Zappa it's completely nuts, isn't it? In a good way.
Well, so I've got...
It's not that crazy,
No.
It's still, the melodies and lyrics still pop.
I've got an answer for you for this. There's 3 answers to this. What I've just described and what you've correctly confirmed, it's a classical musical approach. Because classical music, using the right notes and the right chords, Beethoven could so easily go from one key to another and just completely take you by surprise. The Beatles approach is very... The same way I said classical about Beach Boys, the Beatles, it's simple. It's pop/blues. You can kind of guess 9 times out of 10 where the next Beatle chord is going to go. Now, you might have 3 or 4 different options, but you know that it's going to be one of these. With Zappa, so don't forget, Beach Boys, classical, Beatles, blues and pop, and with Zappa, it's jazz. Because you can flow anywhere between them, and you can just, in the split second, you can take it. There's also some classical influence with Zappa. He was into very avant-garde composers like Edgar Varese, who would just completely fuck around with all the chords and stuff. But I just love that I keep repeating it, and I will keep on repeating it for this episode, that I love that we're hearing hugely classically inspired instruments and chord progressions presented in one of the most pop formats, especially during the 60s.
Yeah, it is. And again, if you want to make the greatest rock and roll album of all times, in order to be the greatest, you have to sell well, you have to make sure that the people are going to listen to it and talk about it.
Yeah.
So there's a really fine line between being extremely creative and still being able to communicate with people through your music. And I think the main element for that, for the pop sound of this album, for let's put it, the elements in the album that make it, if not conventional, make it accessible for me are vocal harmonies, the melodies, and the lyrics.
Absolutely.
So basically, if you isolate the vocals, you could put a conventional instrumentation throughout the whole album, and in my opinion, it would still be great.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be as epic and iconic as it is, but it would still be a great, maybe pop album. It wouldn't be rock, in my opinion, because there's no innovation, no freedom if you just like play the predictable stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the instruments are providing a, I would use the word unpredictable, the unpredictable background for those very melodic vocal lines. And I think this is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Again, I mean, carrying on with instruments, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, which is I wanted you to tell us about the very unusual and very unorthodox use of percussion in this album, because there's not much drums, is there? And if we think about what drums is for Western music, drums mainly, look at what Ringo's doing, is keeping time, keeping a backbeat, keeping the other instrumentalists in time, providing a little rhythm and a little beat. But you think about the song "I'm Waiting for the Day," it just starts with boom, 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 ba ba bum, ba boom. It's a leading instrument. It's not. It's not here. Okay, here's the tempo. Everyone ready to get in. Percussion is playing such an important part of this album as a leading instrument, not as a background timekeeper.
No, exactly. That's an orchestral kind of vibe, because when you have percussion in orchestras, they're not keeping the beat like in rock music and pop music. They do doing some interventions, and sometimes they have just a cymbal, sometimes you have a timpani phrase, and they use that kind of vibe. And I think what adds to that is not only the fact that percussion is pretty much a melodical instrument instead of percussion itself in the album, is the fact they use unusual stuff like there's an empty water bottle in Caroline No, and there's a kind of Coke in Pet Sounds, which is an instrumental number. So it's like, all right. And here's another thing: the title song is an instrumental, which is, it's a bit of the studio instrumental tracks in the album. They give you a bit of a break, between one section and another of the album. They work really well, and you can hear all those weird percussion instruments all the way through. There's some tambourines played on 2 and 4 sometimes, so you do have an element of backbeat. The backbeat is the 2 and 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. When you clap your hands on 2 and 4, if you do it properly, we talked about this before. So if you clap your hands on 2 and 4, or when the snare drum plays on 2 and 4, that's the backbeat, and that's so essential to rock and roll that it feels like it's impossible to make it work without it. And they did make it work. There's some elements of that. There's some tambourines and some stuff playing, trying to provide a certain backbeat. But as you said, sometimes you have a tuba drum phrase leading into nothing, because there's no other drumming ideas coming after.
You're right.
The leader, and it's I think it's the use of percussion and the use of objects to make sounds. It's so different that could have gone really wrong. I don't know how they achieved that.
One song where there is actually drums for the purpose of keeping time, for the purpose of giving us a steady backbeat, and actually it's probably the most accessible song on the album, is track 7, Sloop John B. It vaguely resembles a blues / pop chord structure, doesn't it? It's the one song that feels like, oh, this is familiar. This is a taste of what of taking their standard original surf pop music and incorporating it. Listen, it's still different and unconventional in some ways, but it is the most accessible song on the album, isn't it?
It is, and that's why it probably was released as a single, and it's one of my favorites. Maybe I like the pop stuff. I think this song, in my opinion, has some folk vibes. I know, but it does feel, if you think about the vocals. If that song for me, if it was played on acoustic guitar and vocals, it would be closer to a folk song than anything else. The weird instruments or objects they're using is what makes it very different to what you would expect. And there's a really kind of short section with vocals only, a few bars with no instruments and beautiful vocal harmonies. There's one part when you think, oh wow, those guys can sing. And I want to make a comment about this, and I want to ask you a question about this.
Okay.
You can go on about the instruments and everything else, but maybe the fact that they decided to only sing and let other people play the instruments is one of the best decisions they could have made, because they could focus on singing in a certain way and being creative. And I would ask you this: do you think, as singers, or let's be more specific, do you think their vocal harmonies are better than the Beatles?
Yes, always. And that's something I've thought of, and I've had the opinion of before. Firstly, there's more of them that sing, isn't there? With the Beatles, Ringo didn't often sing. It was mainly Paul and John, but George got in there.
George used to do some.
Well, there is, Ringo did sing on.
He did use. He would mainly
What Goes On?
vocals. Like, Boys from the first album.
Yeah. What Goes On, another one.
What Goes On. There would be at least one song per album with Ringo on vocals.
Yeah. But they still had, like I said earlier, they had a very conventional way of singing harmonies. And that is, if you look at a piano, you play the root note, which is the note in the melody. You go a third up, and that harmonizes the chord. And you go a fifth up from the root, and you've got the root 3 and 5, which is the standard structure of a chord you play. And that's very conventional, especially for blues and for pop and for Western music. Whereas the Beach Boys, especially in this album, we already said about the tonal centers and the keys and the unconventional time signatures and structures. Adding on to that, vocal harmonies that aren't typical, that aren't usual to hear, that have different voicings. For example, I'm making this up. Don't quote me as a fact. But whereas I said the Beatles do root 3 and 5, maybe the Beach Boys did root 6 and 7. Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's the sort of stuff they were messing around with, saying, oh, does this sound good? Does this sound interesting? So in terms of vocals in pop music, I don't know if this has been bettered, because
I don't think it has. I'm with you on that one. I don't think any album has better vocal harmonies than this one.
Certainly
I'm
not.
a big fan of the Beatles and Queen vocal harmonies. Yes, they have great vocal harmonies, but to be honest, this is the best album in terms of vocal harmonies I ever heard in my life.
There's something incredibly special and unique, isn't there? It is just, you hear it and you think there's something not right, but I love it. There's something unorthodox. There's something unconventional.
And let me talk about one of my favorite songs right at the end of the album, the song "Here Today," the 10th track of the album.
Yeah.
Because of the harmonies, because of the way they decided to arrange the song, it feels like, regardless of where they go with the song, every time the chorus comes, it's a blast.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, that's the chorus again. And it always works. And they take the song to weird places. They go back to that chorus. And by that point in the album is when I believe the lyrics are going slightly more realistic. It's a really down-to-earth approach on love, instead of, as I said, oh, I'm in love. It's very kind of naive teenage love. There's a line in that song I really like. You've got to keep in mind, love is here today and it's gone tomorrow.
Wow.
So it's
simple.
And I don't see it as negative. It's like, enjoy.
Seize the day.
Yeah, seize the day. And it's realistic. It's not like it's not as naive as in the beginning of the album. So you got a bit of everything, in terms of lyrics as well. And again, I don't know how they came up with that, but the combination of those lyrics with the completely nonsensical orchestration that they use sometimes, it simply works. It simply, for me, it's like a soundtrack for a nice movie or anything like that.
there's a cohesion within it, isn't there? If you
Mhm.
listen to Rubber Soul, yes, it is an album full of great songs. Yes, it is an album where lyrically, thematically, it makes sense from start to finish. But each song is different, isn't it? Each song
Yeah.
has a different sound, a different I don't know what I'm trying to say, a different feeling, a different emotion. Whereas, as you've just said, Pet sounds like it could be a bunch of songs from one movie, doesn't it?
Yes,
Whereas
it
the
could.
Beatles, again, we're just hypothetically saying this. Rubber Soul could have been different songs from a bunch of romantic movies, for example.
Yeah.
Or but if we're talking about the funny sides of Rubber Soul, it could have been a bunch of songs from a bunch of different comedy movies that all made sense. They're all released around the same time, etc. But Pet Sounds, despite the fact that the songs are different, it's not like one flows into the other and it's a continuous 36-minute piece just split here and there. They are different songs. They do sound different, but there is a huge sense of cohesion there where everything sounds right and everything sounds I don't know what to say about it. It blows my mind just thinking about it. Everything's
That cohesion is probably the biggest achievement of the album. How can you
yeah.
go that far from predictability and
You're right. Yeah,
do something no one has ever done before, but it makes sense from start to finish, and it's short and sweet. The album
yeah.
is like is how long is it? It's 35
36.
minutes, 36 minutes, 35
Yeah,
minutes, 57 seconds to be more precise.
crazy.
And it's like it's short, and it just maybe that's one of the reasons why it's good. Maybe you don't want to hear that for an hour and a half.
Yeah,
You know,
maybe yeah,
it's
shorter
just
better. I mean,
exactly.
I've
This
been sorry, go
eh,
on.
no, if I don't know if there's any other songs you want to talk about, but I have I got some of my notes here, some things I didn't want to forget to mention. Uh, one of my favorite songs in the album is "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times," track
Yeah,
11, and because for me, the idea behind the lyrics is the most rock and roll thing in the album
okay,
because it's about not belonging, not
yeah,
being, it's kind of like the title itself, I just wasn't made for these times. And I love there's one line, and that's how brilliant they are. The line is sung by the BVs. So you got to
okay,
pay attention to it.
all right,
It's not something you're gonna hear it like right in your face. It's sung by the harmonies or the backing vocalists. Ain't found the right thing I can put my heart and soul into. So
okay.
how many people feel like that? It's like
Yeah,
it's not that you're not passionate. It's like you didn't find that one thing that makes people uh put all their emotions into it
yeah.
and that motivation for being alive and for achieving stuff. And it's a really great line, and it's hidden behind the main vocal.
It's
And
just great songwriting.
genius.
There's in that song, there's the horse sounds at the end.
Yeah,
Like the click clopping of the horses,
yeah,
like that. I thought that was hilarious because just the juxtaposition between the song title saying "I just wasn't made for these times" and a horse sound. Now, horses were a method of transport before cars.
yeah.
So I wonder if I don't know if I don't
Maybe
know if I'm
it's
looking too
yeah.
much into it, but I
Well,
just love that he's saying we're not in the right times. Here's a horse sound at the end. I don't know. That's just me. Maybe I've looked a bit deep into it.
maybe it does make you think about medieval times, and
Yeah, yeah.
it's yeah, it makes sense. I've heard I read this article that says that Brian Wilson wanted to bring a horse into the studio, and like it's like I think they talked him out of it. Uh,
That would have been something else, though. I mean,
yeah,
if
but
everything else,
that shows his motivation. That shows
yeah.
that rivalry he had with the Beatles. Um,
Can I interrupt and say that I
yeah,
don't actually try to avoid the word rivalry because
yeah.
everything you read about it, Brian Wilson had so much admiration for them, wasn't it? And I suppose,
Yes.
you know, in fairness to you, you can still be rivals because you're both competing for the number one spot on the billboards. But whenever I hear rivals, I always think there's kind of a nemesis thing. I've just been watching Drive to Survive, and I think Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, they're rivals. But I think Brian
Yeah.
Wilson and the Beatles had so much respect for each other.
And the music industry, when you have musicians from different bands challenging each other, that
Yeah,
means we are the winners
yeah,
because they gonna try their best to be as good or better than the other guy, and that's still subjective. It's not like sport when it's that guy won the game, so it's like that he's the winner.
yeah.
And music, it's like, well, you might like one band more than the other, but if both are trying really hard to be as good as the other one, that means we all
Yeah,
winners, I
we
think.
all.
And I think, and because I said there's no rivalry, there's an interesting quote from Paul McCartney. He said,
I was just gonna go on to
uh-huh,
that. Go on, you go for it.
okay, the song God Only Knows is the best song ever written.
Yeah, I
And it
was
was a
just
single as well.
I was going to move on just quickly and say about the other stuff. So you're right, and I think what you just mentioned is when other musicians are sort of taking what a band or artist has done and giving their opinions on it, both positive and negative. I think that's a huge step because so many bands on albums aren't talked about just simply because they're not relevant. But check this out. I've got this here section in my notes as critics, but actually it's just other musicians talking about this album. So you're quite right. Paul McCartney said, "No one is educated musically until they've heard this album. God Only Knows is the greatest song ever written."
Yeah.
Pete Townsend said, now he had a negative thing to say about it. He said, "It's too remote and too way out. It's written for a feminine audience." Eric Clapton had to say, "Everyone in the band loved it." That's Cream. Without a doubt, a pop genius. Spencer Davis said, "Brian Wilson is a great record producer. I'm a fan now and I want to listen to this LP again and again." John Lennon said Wilson was doing some very great things, and Mick Jagger disliked the songs but enjoyed the sound and the vocal harmonies. And I think when you have a list of critics like that, I don't really mind that Pete Townsend and Mick Jagger had some negative things to say. When you've got Paul McCartney, Clapton, Spencer Davis, and John Lennon in your corner, that's a good enough review, isn't it?
Exactly. Also, you got another Pete Townshend is famous for trying to be provocative as well,
Yeah,
and the Who is famous for performing mainly, according to themselves, to male audiences.
yeah,
You know, and that's why he's using the feminine thing as, oh, is this for girls, not for boys? And in the end of the day, music is for whoever wants to listen to, and
yeah,
it's not negative if you hit one audience more than the other. And I think they were aiming for the audience, but they've managed to impress the musicians as well and artists. And as I said, even if you have a couple of those guys making negative comments, the fact that they have to have an opinion about this album and they can't avoid
yes, good
commenting
point.
about the existence of this album, it means it really got somewhere. Like it really reached a position in rock history that is undeniable, and you can't simply ignore, as I did for years, the existence of this masterpiece.
The sort of quickly, so moving on from the critics, moving on to the accolades. It very, very frequently. I'd be very surprised actually to hear if there was an organization that didn't have it in their top five at least. But check this out. Mojo, The Times, New Musical Express, and Uncut, they're all music publications, all have it as the greatest album of all time. Rolling Stone, VH1, and Pitchfork all have it in the top three, and I can pretty much guarantee that Sergeant Pepper and Revolver are maybe the other three. I think actually Bob Dylan, Blonde on Blonde, was in a couple of them as well. Melody Maker could not choose between Pet Sounds or Revolver for Album of the Year, 1966. And this album is preserved in the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Which is an achievement for pop music, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe you know more than me. I'm not sure it's just pop music, but being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So I don't know any other albums that are in it, but the Congress have said that this is culturally hugely significant.
It's a piece of history. It's a piece of American history. Isn't it? That's
Exactly.
basically what they say. It's not only art; it became part of history.
What do
And
you think? Sorry,
yeah,
I was going to ask you, what do you think? Because I think it's quite funny that the blues came from America and classical music from Europe. I mean, I'm being very generalizing here, but yet when we cross it over, Beatles go for the bluesy stuff and Beach Boys go for the classical stuff.
well,
Just for these albums, it's
it's funny
different, isn't
because
it?
you have some like, well, the very first song on the album has a shuffle vibe, which is very bluesy. You
Yeah,
know, the groove, at least the groove, and the Beatles did flirt a lot with classical music as well. So I think the Beatles, right in the beginning, they sounded more like a blues slash rock band, rock and roll
yeah,
band. But they did went really far into the classical stuff. So I think the Beach Boys with this album, they went further really in terms
yeah.
of going away from the traditional roots of rock music. And yeah, it blew my mind. And it's funny that I've only listened to this whole album a few weeks ago for the first time. And I mean, don't let that happen to you,
Yeah.
whoever you are listening to us.
Well, check this
Just
out.
go on and listen from start to finish.
Multiple times, please. Yeah. So the Beach Boys biographer, John Stebbins, he had this to say about the style of the album. He said, Brian Wilson defies any notion of genre safety. There isn't much rocking here and even less rolling. Pet Sounds is at times futuristic, progressive and experimental. There's no boogie, no woogie, and the only blues are in the themes and in Brian's voice. That sums up beautifully, doesn't it? I mean, I think he hasn't obviously said that the part that I'm strongly feeling that he hasn't said is that I think there's a huge classical influence. But other than that, in terms of modern Western styles and genres, he's hit the nail of the head. It's not rock and roll. It's not blues. It's not pop. It's not R&B. It's not doo-wop. It's not boogie woogie. It's tiny little pieces of all of them fitted together in one big puzzle and embellished with classical instruments, isn't it?
It is. Wow, that's a good way of defining it. Yeah, and it's oh man, I don't know what more to say about it. It's
Well,
just
I was going to
it
ask you.
has become an album that I think I'm gonna like it even more when I listen to it again and again.
Brilliant.
Because my third listen to the album is when I was like, oh wow, there's
Yeah.
something here.
And
You know,
there's
that's
parts. Sorry.
no, but maybe because it was so different. Um, it kind of related a bit more to what British bands were doing at the time, and it wasn't that well received in America. It charted number well, when I mean not well received, charted number 10, which is great achievement. But for the greatest album of all times, as they wanted it to be, it wasn't what they expected, I guess. But it was number 2 in the UK, which says a lot. I
Yeah.
think maybe that was the reason why Hendrix came from America to the UK, because I think that kind of experimental music was maybe really well received in the UK in a way
Mm.
that the American audiences probably were not ready for or not
Yeah.
didn't want to buy or whatever. But
Yeah.
once you're successful in the UK, there's a chance that that's going to reflect in your American market as well. So it's interesting. They charted in very different positions in America and the UK.
Yeah. Um, is there, you said you had some other notes. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we sort of finish up? Any other?
No, I think it's time for your monologue. I
Good.
think. What do you
Okay. All
think?
right. Well, yeah, I think that too. But before that, I was just going to ask you what your favorite, if you have a favorite moment of the album or a favorite song, or even one bar of music, because this is the album where one bar of music can stand out. You know.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed Sloop John B.
Yeah.
Uh, I think I like the overall concept of the changing the theme of the lyrics towards the end.
Mm.
And the song here today is I would say it's difficult. It's really weird because I really love the way the album starts, but as it progresses, I think I like the end of the album better than I like the first
It,
ones.
it
And I think
almost
here
matures,
today,
doesn't it? It matures as it goes
yes,
on.
it does. I think Caroline No is too sad for an ending. So my favorites are Here Today and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times.
Nice. Okay,
And
that's
the
really
single is Loop John B. So those are my favorite songs. Do you have a favorite song
I
or
do. I've
two?
got a few. Wouldn't it be nice? That's not me. I'm waiting for the day, and Caroline No. Actually, the that last minute and a half of the album where you've got. I know you're right. Caroline No is a pretty sad song, but just the chord progression, because again, the one genre we haven't chatted about actually is jazz, and there's not a huge amount of jazz in it, so I don't think we need to go too far in. But Pet Sounds, the instrumental, that's almost like big band jazz orchestration going on.
Yeah.
And the thing about jazz, if you get jazz down to its bare bones, it's about tension and release. It's about creating tension with the notes you're playing, with the chords you're deciding to play, and then releasing it to sort of, release the tension and to give the listener a pleasant experience. With Caroline No, I just love that simple melody that repeats over and over again. It goes do 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 do. But done. Then that's not, and it releases me. And I just think that I've been speechless a few times this episode, man, because I don't know how to describe it. I love it. And this isn't actually, I wouldn't, maybe after this episode, it might pop into like my top albums of all time, but I don't listen to this and think, these are my favorite songs. This is my favorite album. But you cannot help. Do you know what? This is the perfect moment to go into my monologue. Yeah? Yeah,
Yes.
okay, here
Let's
we
go
go.
into it then.
It's a bit longer than usual, but I think it's worth it. So, using classical instruments to lead the music, using percussion to do something other than keep time, using odd chord voicings to create tension and ambiguate the tonal center of the song, using tempo and meter changes alongside unconventional song structures, all the while creating beautiful and agreeable pop melodies and deep, meaningful lyrics to accompany it, has led to the creation and execution of some of the best contemporary music ever written by one person. And at 23 years of age, this is a hugely remarkable feat for Brian Wilson. I think it's fantastic that he was using the Beatles as motivation and inspiration to push his song and lyric writing to the fullest. I think it surpasses Rubber Soul and maybe even Revolver as a musical achievement, especially for the time. Is it accessible pop music to the same extent as the Beatles? No. The Beatles took their pop music and they sprinkled it with exotic and progressive sounds, whilst Wilson seems to have based the entire album on the basis of it being unusual, unorthodox, unconventional, but he completely retains the pop mentality, and the payoff is definitely poppy, because you come away, despite the unusual and uncomfortable elements, having pleasant melodies, agreeable chord structures, even though, it does float about. So for that reason, I think the Beatles music works more as out and out pop music. And as I said earlier, for me, the Beach Boys are right in the middle. If you go too far one way, you get to Zappa, the avant-garde, way out there jazz fusion rock. And if you go too far the other way, you go to the Beatles, which is very poppy, very accessible. The Beach Boys with this album are sitting right in the middle. I love the idea, and I'm telling myself that Beach Boys and the Beatles were one-upping each other for a few years. Rubber Soul came out. Brian Wilson said, well, fuck it, I'm going to do Pet Sounds. The Beatles said, what? Well, okay, we'll do Revolver. Then Beach Boys said, oh, well, we'll do Smiley Smile. And then finally the Beatles said, we'll do Sergeant Pepper. And everyone said, fine, okay, Beatles, you win. But the Beatles get mentioned in the same sentences as classical composers for their melody and songwriting, for the chord progressions they sort of popularized, and I think it's only fair to include Brian into this discussion. The music theory and exceptional ear that the likes of Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart had to have to write their music and organize their chord voicings is substantial. But for Brian Wilson to have maturely and effectively blended so many different styles and influences into one cohesive and united album, using so many unorthodox techniques, but actually executing a pop album, is nothing short of legendary songwriting. Couple that with his technological innovations and ambitions to create a sonically complete album, then to me, he deserves to be in the same category as the composers mentioned above. I feel like what they did in their time is comparable to what Brian has done in his time. And for that reason, for me, Pet Sounds is one of the greatest musical achievements in Western music popular history.
Oh, wow. You've said it all.
I'll put that into essay form. Sorry for the length of that, everyone. I'll put that into essay form. I'll send it off to the Library of Congress. Maybe they can add that to it. But all jokes aside, I spent a lot of time writing that because I felt it deserved it, man. I felt the album and Brian. Listen, he's still
this album. I think this album is so well crafted that there's nothing we could do with a podcast episode that would make justice to how nothing no words could actually be fair and describe what this album actually is and what it represents for music industry and for art in general. So best thing you can do is to stop listening to us now and listen to the album.
And with that, we'll end it there. Thank you, bro. Just quickly, I wanted to say thank you. I'm so glad, like I said at the start, that we found an album that you didn't sort of know already. Because I'm so glad. It puts a smile on my face to see the smile on your face when you told me what you thought of the album. So yeah, I mean, let's end it here. You're right. I was going to ask you one more question, but I think what's the point? Like, we've gone through it already. There's no need. Guys, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this. I mean, like I said, this is not in my all-time top 10 or maybe even 20 albums, but as Felipe mentioned, the craft of it, the passion in it.
The fact that someone is brave enough to say, I'm going to do the greatest album of all times, even if you don't consider it as such, the attempt of doing it and the attitude and the effort and the hours and hours of hard work into creating the album all of that is in itself something that most humans have never done. So hats off to Brian Wilson. And to like every musician involved in the album. And
can we just say that the other Beach Boys were involved and they played their part as well? But this is Brian's masterpiece, isn't it? So well done, the rest of the Beach Boys. You've done it again. Yeah. But Brian, hats off to you, Felipe. One more very quick question. Yeah. Brian Wilson set out to record and achieve one of the greatest rock albums ever written. Did he achieve it?
Yes. Because you said one of the greatest, yes, because I don't think there's such a thing as the greatest album ever.
Well, there's too many variables, isn't there? There's too many variables.
It's too hard to pick one album. But now, even if it's not fun for my personal taste, I think in terms of historical relevance to music, it should be put into anyone's top 10.
So, sorry, I know I said last question, but you just said that it's not to your personal taste. But do you like the music? Would you listen to it?
Yes, I do. I love it. I'm saying it is. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
It could maybe it wouldn't be on my top 10 because there's so many albums that I like. I don't know. But when I think about the most important ones and how that has influenced everything that came after it, then yes, it would be on the top 10. And the greatest of all time, well, I don't think no one deserves that. Because it would be unfair on all the other bands we've been talking about in our podcast. And
but one right?
Oh man, so many great albums. Thanks a lot for introducing me to this.
That's all good, bro. I'm so happy you loved it. That's really cool. Anyway, guys, thank you again for joining us on the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. As I say, nearly every episode, please, whatever you're listening on, please give us a review. It takes a few seconds to hit 5 stars or on Apple or Spotify. And if you've got an extra minute, just type what you love about the show for us. Helps get us up the charts, helps boost up the algorithms. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. We're doing a bit more there. Now we're posting some clips for you to get involved in and join in some conversations on our social media pages. I'm not going to ask Felipe where you can find us this week because I just told you. It's the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast on Facebook and Instagram and all your podcasts and stuff everywhere. So please come along, get involved, give us a like and review, and that will help us a lot. So thank you for joining.
If you've got nothing to say, just type "not too shabby."
There we go. We'll take that.
A lot worse, and give us 5 stars.
Lovely. So thanks again for joining, guys. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
Thank you, and keep on rocking, everyone.
And as usual, take care and long live rock and roll.